All right, guys. So we're going to talk about bacteria versus viruses. So we've already talked about bacteria, but we haven't actually talked about viruses yet, other than when we talked about characteristics of life, when we said they were not living. So um, the size comparison of them, this is probably actually even smaller than this. So this is showing a comparison of the types of cells or particles that could be filtered out by the regular kinds of masks. So um, the particles that can be filtered by masks, a lot of them, like the N95 masks that are really good, are about this size. Coronavirus is a little bigger than those, so theoretically, if the mask is totally sealed to your face, then it should be able to get caught by the mask and not go through. A bacteria is significantly bigger than that coronavirus. This is a eukaryotic virus, and bacteria, remember, are prokaryotes. They're a lot smaller than eukaryotes because you see here, this red blood cell here is one of your cells, and it's not even the biggest kind of cell that you have. So look at the size of the coronavirus versus your red blood cell. So there are viruses that also infect bacteria, and they're a lot smaller than the eukaryotic viruses. All right. Um, so when we're talking about these, the reason why there's even a question of whether the viruses are alive is that they have DNA. They have, or at least some kind of genetic information. So bacteria, they have the DNA in their little nucleoid, which basically just means it's a section of the cell that has DNA, but it's not actually inside of a nucleus. So they have that circular DNA inside the nucleus. It's just one big circular chromosome rather than the linear ones that we have. They've got the cytoplasm, which is the cell liquid surrounding it. Cytoplasm literally means cell liquid. The ribosomes, which are these little dots here that make proteins. And the cell membrane or the plasma membrane, the cell wall, and then the capsule around the outside that's for protection purposes. And then the pilus is these little things coming off of here, and the flagella is this tail. So if you did the bacteria prokaryote worksheet yesterday, then you have seen this picture, and this is basically the exact same labels that it asks you to provide on that. So when we look here at these viruses, so this is what the prokaryotic viruses look like, and this is what the eukaryotic viruses look like. So the eukaryotic viruses are basically a little bit more sophisticated. So the prokaryotic viruses, all they are is DNA or RNA, could be DNA or RNA, inside of this little contraption here, and it really does look like that. It looks like a robot. But it's all of this right here is called the capsid. So it's made of protein, but it's called a capsid, CAPSID. So at the very, very basic level, the only two things that viruses are made of are the genetic material, which is DNA or RNA, and the protein capsid. And it's the same thing for this eukaryotic virus here too. So they act a little bit differently though. For this kind of virus, this like little spring looking thing here actually does sort of act as that. So what it does is it sits on the bacteria. So it'll sit like on the surface of the bacteria, and then it'll actually like inject the DNA into it. So the DNA travels down this and gets stuck into the bacteria. Whereas these, we'll see in a little bit how they get into your cells. So it's a little bit more sophisticated. So like coronavirus is a eukaryotic virus, and this is what it looks like. It has these little receptors sticking off the outside because it has a little membrane around the outside. So it sort of looks like your cells. So it's a little bit more sneaky than the bacteria version. So reproduction for bacteria versus viruses. Bacteria, they reproduce via binary fission. So what they do is they have their DNA and they have their little plasmid here. They make copies of both of them, and then they start to split, and then they just split. So these two cells are totally identical, and they just perform binary fission, which is making it's just splitting into two, which is literally what that means, doing a form of asexual reproduction. So they just made a copy. Whereas viruses are not able to reproduce on their own. And so we talked about here that the bacteria have ribosomes. Ribosomes make proteins. And we talked about here that the only two things that viruses are really made of our proteins and DNA. So viruses do not have the ability to make their own proteins. So they have to hijack your cell's machinery to be able to make those proteins. Okay, so eukaryotic virus, so I was saying that the prokaryotic virus, all it does is it sits on the surface of the cell and it kind of injects its DNA inside of it. And then this little empty shell sort of floats off. A eukaryotic virus, like coronavirus, for example, those little receptors match up to receptors that are on your cells. So it's really sneaky about getting in. So it makes your cell think that it's totally normal for it to come in. And so the contents inside, so the protein and the DNA or RNA, go inside your cell. It makes your cell think that it's its own DNA, makes copies of everything, puts it back together, and then they kind of come out of the cell. And if enough of this is happening at once, then it causes the cell to completely burst, rupture, lyse. It all means the same thing. So to lyse is to break, to rupture is to break. Anyway, so it bursts open if there's too many coming out at once. And particularly so for bacteria, because notice here this is kind of coming out like in little blobs around it, picking up some of that membrane. So it can do that kind of gracefully. Whereas with bacteria, the only option they really have is to break out. So they actually do totally lyse or break the bacteria. So eukaryotic viruses are nice and sneaky, but that's how they reproduce. So they land on there, they somehow get their DNA into the cell makes copies, and then they come out having made lots of copies of themselves via your cell machinery. So for illnesses, for bacteria, the strep throat is caused by a bacteria called Streptococcus. UTIs are caused typically by E. coli, that it belongs in your large intestine. It's a good thing there, but when it gets into your urinary tract, then it starts causing some problems. Staph infection is Staphylococcus. That's a common infection in hospitals. So all of those are bacterial illnesses, and you can treat those with antibiotics. So if you have strep throat, for example, which is shown in this picture, you are given antibiotics to get rid of it. And viruses like COVID-19, the flu, hepatitis B, HIV, these can be treated by what we call antiviral medications. So that's kind of a temporary fix. It's like giving you an antibiotic. It doesn't make you stay immune to it, but it can get rid of what you have. Whereas vaccines are more of a preventative measure. You get it ahead of time so that you can have your body make the immune cells it needs to be able to fight it. So that's why you get a flu vaccine. Even if it's not perfectly for the strain of flu that you end up getting, it still makes the illness not nearly as bad because your body is at least partially immune to it. But you have to have had at least like a week to kind of process that vaccine before your immune system is capable of tackling it on its own. So that is it for bacteria versus viruses. Just a little back run through here. Viruses are much, much, much smaller than bacteria, which are also much smaller than the eukaryotic, our cells. They both have DNA, but bacteria has all of this other stuff, including ribosomes, to make their own proteins, whereas viruses do not have those ribosomes, but are made of protein. So they have to use your ribosomes or a bacteria's ribosomes to be able to make more of themselves, because otherwise they have no way to make that protein. They do have some kind of genetic material, whether it's DNA or RNA inside of it. Bacteria reproduce via binary fission, and viruses inject their DNA into the cell, get copies made, and then they come out. And then the illnesses, bacteria are treated by antibiotics, and viruses are treated by antiviral medications and are prevented by vaccines.